A young man named Brian marries an old black woman, Ms. Laverne, for her fortune. But one shocking detail changes everything, uncovering a dark secret from her life. Is there more to this marriage than meets the eye, and can Brian survive the truth? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Brian slouched at the bar, his shoulders heavy with the weight of his worries. The dim light cast shadows on his handsome face, hiding the lines of stress etched around his eyes. He stared into his half-empty glass, swirling the amber liquid as if it held the answers to his problems. "Another round?" the bartender asked, eyeing Brian's nearly empty wallet. Brian shook his head. "Can't afford it," he muttered, his voice thick with frustration. As he nursed his drink, the chatter of nearby patrons drifted over. A group of well-dressed men sat at a table, their voices carrying easily in the quiet bar. "Did you hear about old Ms. Laverne?" one of them said. "That woman's loaded, I tell you." Brian's ears perked up and he leaned slightly closer, trying not to look obvious. Another man chuckled. "Yeah, she's got more money than she knows what to do with. All those rich husbands she's outlived." "Must be nice," a third chimed in. "Living in that big house, not a care in the world." Brian's mind started racing. He'd heard of Ms. Laverne before, a wealthy black woman widow who lived on the other side of town. As he listened to the men talk, a plan began to form in his desperate mind. What if he could charm Ms. Laverne, maybe even marry her? It seemed crazy, but the more he thought about it, the more appealing it became. His debts would vanish overnight. No more dodging bill collectors or eating ramen for every meal. Brian finished his drink, a new energy coursing through him. For the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of hope. It might be wrong, he knew. But what choice did he have? He was drowning, and Ms. Laverne could be his lifeline. As he left the bar, Brian's mind was already working out how to meet the wealthy widow. He didn't know it yet, but this decision would change his life in ways he couldn't imagine. Over the next few days, Brian threw himself into researching Ms. Laverne. He spent hours at the local library, poring over old newspapers and charity event programs. The more he learned, the more his excitement grew. Ms. Laverne's wealth was even greater than he'd imagined. She had inherited fortunes from not one, but 3 late husbands. But what surprised Brian most was her generosity. Nearly every article mentioned her charitable work, funding scholarships, supporting local shelters, and donating to countless causes. "She's like a real-life angel," Brian muttered to himself, a twinge of guilt pricking at his conscience. He pushed the feeling aside, focusing instead on how to meet her. That's when he remembered his old friend Sarah, who worked for an event planning company. He gave her a call, his heart racing as he waited for her to pick up. "Sarah, it's Brian. I need a favor," he said, trying to keep his voice casual. "You still planning those fancy charity events?" Sarah laughed. "Sure am." "Why? You suddenly develop a taste for rubber chicken and small talk?" Brian chuckled nervously. "Not exactly. I was hoping you might be able to get me into one of Ms. Laverne's events. I've been reading about her work, and I'd love to get involved." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Ms. Laverne? She's pretty selective about her guest lists, Brian. What's this really about?" Brian's mind raced, searching for a believable excuse. I've been thinking about my life, Sarah. I want to do something meaningful, you know. Ms. Laverne's work is inspiring. I thought if I could meet her, maybe I could volunteer or something." Sarah's tone softened. "Well, that's actually really sweet, Brian. I'll see what I can do. No promises, though." A week later, Brian's phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. His hands shook as he read the message. "You're in. Charity gala next Saturday. Don't make me regret this." Brian grinned, his heart pounding with excitement and nerves. He was one step closer to meeting Ms. Laverne and, he hoped, changing his life forever. The night of the charity gala arrived, and Brian stood nervously adjusting his borrowed suit in the grand ballroom. His eyes scanned the crowd, searching for Ms. Laverne. When he finally spotted her, his breath caught in his throat. She stood tall and elegant, her silver hair gleaming under the chandeliers. Taking a deep breath, Brian made his way through the crowd. As he approached, Ms. Laverne turned, her warm brown eyes meeting his. "Ms. Laverne," Brian said, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I'm Brian. It's an honor to meet you." Ms. Laverne smiled, a hint of curiosity in her expression. "Hello, Brian. I don't believe we've met before. What brings you to our little gathering?" Brian's carefully rehearsed speech flew out of his mind. Instead, he found himself speaking from the heart. "Your work, Ms. Laverne. I've been reading about all you've done for the community. It's truly inspiring." Something in Ms. Laverne's eyes softened. "Well, that's very kind of you to say, Brian. Tell me, what aspect of our work interests you most?" For the next hour, Brian and Ms. Laverne talked. He listened intently as she shared stories of the lives she'd touched, the challenges she'd faced, and the joy she found in giving back. To his surprise, Brian found himself genuinely moved by her words. "You know, Brian," Ms. Laverne said, her voice gentle, "in all my years, I've learned that true wealth isn't about money. It's about the lives we touch, the love we share." Brian nodded, a lump forming in his throat. For a moment, he forgot about his scheme, lost in the wisdom of her words. As the evening wore on, Ms. Laverne surprised Brian by asking about his own life. He hesitated, then found himself opening up about his struggles, his dreams, and his fears. "Life can be hard, child," Ms. Laverne said, patting his hand. "But remember, every challenge is an opportunity for growth." When it was time to part, Ms. Laverne smiled warmly at Brian. "It's been a pleasure, Brian. Your interest in our work is refreshing. Perhaps we'll see you at future events?" Brian nodded, a mix of emotions swirling inside him. "I'd like that very much, Ms. Laverne. Thank you for your time." As he watched her walk away, Brian realized that this conversation had left a deeper impression on him than he'd ever expected. Over the next few weeks, Brian threw himself into his plan to win Ms. Laverne's affection. He sent her beautiful bouquets of flowers, each with a heartfelt note expressing his admiration for her work. The florist raised an eyebrow at his frequent visits, but Brian didn't care. He was on a mission. One sunny Tuesday, Brian walked into the charity's office, his heart pounding. He'd signed up to volunteer, hoping to bump into Ms. Laverne. As luck would have it, she was there, sorting through donation boxes. "Brian," Ms. Laverne's face lit up with surprise. "What brings you here?" He smiled, trying to hide his nervousness. "I wanted to help out. Your words at the gala really stuck with me." Ms. Laverne's eyes twinkled. "Well, isn't that wonderful? We can always use an extra pair of hands." As they worked side by side, Brian found himself genuinely enjoying the task. Ms. Laverne shared stories of the people they were helping, and Brian felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with his original plan. Days turned into weeks, and Brian became a familiar face at the charity. He made sure to volunteer whenever Ms. Laverne was there, soaking up her wisdom and kindness. To his surprise, he found himself looking forward to their time together, not just for his scheme, but for the joy of her company. Ms. Laverne, too, began to soften towards Brian. She appreciated his enthusiasm and the fresh energy he brought to their work. Though she remained guarded, she couldn't help but smile when she saw him walk through the door. One afternoon, as they packed care packages together, Ms. Laverne turned to Brian. "You know, when you first started coming around, I wasn't sure what to make of you. But I must say, your dedication to our cause is truly touching." Brian felt a pang of guilt but pushed it aside. "Thank you, Ms. Laverne. Being here, it's opened my eyes to so much." As they continued their work, Brian couldn't help but notice the warmth in Ms. Laverne's smile, the way her eyes crinkled with genuine pleasure at his presence. His plan was working, but something inside him was changing too in ways he hadn't expected. Ms. Laverne's invitation to dinner caught Brian off guard. He stood on her doorstep, nervously smoothing his shirt. The door opened, revealing Ms. Laverne's warm smile. "Come in, dear," she said, ushering him inside. Brian's eyes widened as he took in the elegant foyer. Ms. Laverne's home was a testament to her wealth, but it was filled with warmth and character. They settled at a beautifully set table, the aroma of home-cooked food filling the air. As they began to eat, Ms. Laverne leaned forward, her eyes twinkling. "So, Brian, tell me about yourself. Where did you grow up?" Brian swallowed hard, his rehearsed story rising to his lips. I grew up in a rough neighborhood," he began, his voice soft. "My parents weren't around much, and we struggled to make ends meet." Ms. Laverne's face softened with sympathy. "Oh, you poor dear, that must have been so difficult." Encouraged, Brian continued, weaving a tale of hardship and perseverance. With each word, he felt a mix of triumph at her growing sympathy and a gnawing guilt in his stomach. As the meal progressed, Ms. Laverne began to share her own stories. Her eyes misted over as she spoke of her late husband. "Oh, Harold was such a wonderful man," she said, her voice filled with love. "We had 50 beautiful years together. He taught me so much about kindness and generosity." Brian felt a sharp pang in his chest. The love in Ms. Laverne's voice was palpable, and for a moment, he saw her not as a wealthy target, but as a woman who had loved deeply and lost. "That sounds really special," he said softly, surprised by the sincerity in his own voice. Ms. Laverne nodded, dabbing at her eyes with a napkin. "It was, dear. It truly was. That's why I try to spread that love through my charity work now. It's what Harold would have wanted." As she continued to share memories of her life with Harold, Brian found himself listening intently. The guilt he felt earlier bubbled up again, stronger this time, but he pushed it down, reminding himself of his debts, of his plan. Yet as the evening wore on, Brian couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Ms. Laverne's stories of love and loss had touched something in him, something he hadn't expected to feel. As the weeks passed, Brian's plan began to unfold. He found himself spending more time with Ms. Laverne, carefully dropping hints about his growing affection for her. He would casually touch her arm when they laughed together, or gaze at her with admiration as she spoke about her charity work. One sunny afternoon, as they strolled through a local park, Brian gathered his courage. "You know, Ms. Laverne," he said softly, "I never expected to feel this way, but being around you makes me so happy." Ms. Laverne's eyes sparkled with a mix of surprise and warmth. "Oh, Brian," she replied, patting his hand gently. "You're such a dear. I enjoy your company too." Encouraged by her response, Brian continued to shower her with attention and compliments. He brought her favorite flowers, remembered small details about her life, and always made time to listen to her stories. Slowly but surely, Ms. Laverne's guard began to lower. She found herself looking forward to Brian's visits and calls. His apparent sincerity and genuine interest in her life touched her heart. One evening, as they shared tea in her cozy living room, Ms. Laverne made a decision. "Brian," she said, setting down her cup, "I'd like you to meet some of my closest friends. They're like family to me, and I want them to know you." Brian's heart raced with a mix of excitement and anxiety. This was progress, but it also meant facing more scrutiny. "I'd be honored," he replied, forcing a smile. The following weekend, Ms. Laverne hosted a small gathering. Brian found himself surrounded by her inner circle, a retired judge, a local business owner, and a longtime friend from her church. As introductions were made, Brian could feel their skeptical gazes. The judge, in particular, seemed to study him intently. "So, Brian," the judge said, his voice stern, "how exactly did you and Laverne meet?" Brian recounted their first encounter at the charity event, careful to emphasize his admiration for Ms. Laverne's philanthropic work. As he spoke, he could see the friends exchanging glances, their doubt evident. But as the evening progressed, Brian's charm began to work its magic. He listened attentively to their stories, asked thoughtful questions, and shared carefully crafted anecdotes about his volunteer work. By the end of the night, the atmosphere had softened. While still cautious, Ms. Laverne's friends seemed willing to give Brian a chance. As the weeks turned into months, Brian and Ms. Laverne's relationship blossomed. They began attending social events and charity functions together, their arms often linked as they walked into grand ballrooms or community centers. At a gala for the local children's hospital, Brian watched in awe as Ms. Laverne moved through the crowd. She greeted everyone with genuine warmth, remembering names and personal details that left people beaming. Her kindness wasn't just for show, it was a part of who she was. "You really care about all these people, don't you?" Brian asked softly, as they shared a quiet moment. Ms. Laverne's eyes twinkled. "Every single one, dear. Each person has a story, and it's a blessing to be part of it, even in a small way." Her words struck a chord in Brian's heart. He'd never met anyone so genuinely invested in others' well-being. As they spent more time together, Brian saw countless examples of Ms. Laverne's compassion. She'd stop to help a struggling mother with her groceries, or spend hours on the phone comforting a friend going through a tough time. One Saturday, Ms. Laverne invited Brian to join her at a soup kitchen where she volunteered regularly. He watched as she served meals with a smile, offering kind words to each person who came through the line. "Why do you do this?" Brian asked, genuinely curious. Ms. Laverne's face softened. "Because everyone deserves dignity and kindness, Brian. We're all human, all deserving of love and respect." Her words and actions began to chip away at Brian's carefully constructed facade. He found himself looking forward to their time together, not because of his ulterior motives, but because he genuinely enjoyed her company. As they left the soup kitchen that day, Ms. Laverne squeezed Brian's hand. "Thank you for coming today. It means so much to share this part of my life with you." Brian felt a warmth spread through his chest, along with a twinge of guilt. For the first time, he began to question his original plan. Ms. Laverne's kindness and compassion were changing him, slowly but surely, in ways he never expected. Ms. Laverne invited Brian to join her for a weekend getaway at her country estate. As they drove through the winding roads, lush green fields stretched out on either side. Brian couldn't help but feel a sense of peace wash over him. The estate was breathtaking, with its sprawling gardens and a charming old house that looked like it held countless stories. Ms. Laverne showed Brian around, her eyes lighting up as she shared memories from her past visits. That evening, they sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon. The air was filled with the sweet scent of blooming flowers and the gentle chirping of crickets. Ms. Laverne sighed softly, her gaze distant. "You know, Brian, I've been coming here for years. It's always been a place of joy for me. But lately, I can't help but feel a bit lonely." Brian turned to look at her, surprised by the vulnerability in her voice. "Lonely? But you're always surrounded by people who care about you." She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yes, and I'm grateful for that. But it's different when you're my age. The thought of growing old alone, it scares me sometimes." Her words hit Brian like a punch to the gut. For the first time, he saw beyond Ms. Laverne's strength and kindness to the very human fears that lay beneath. "I've had a wonderful life," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I worry about what's to come. Will I become a burden? Will I be forgotten?" Brian felt a lump form in his throat. He reached out and took Ms. Laverne's hand, surprised by how much he wanted to comfort her. "You could never be a burden," he said softly. "And I don't think anyone who's met you could ever forget you." Ms. Laverne squeezed his hand, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you, dear. It means a lot to hear you say that." As they sat there in comfortable silence, Brian felt a wave of guilt wash over him. For the first time since he'd hatched his plan, he questioned his motives. Ms. Laverne wasn't just a wealthy woman to be manipulated. She was a kind, vulnerable human being who had welcomed him into her life. As the weekend drew to a close, Brian's mind raced with thoughts of Ms. Laverne's vulnerability and his own conflicting emotions. On the drive back to the city, he made a decision. It was time to take the next step in his plan. Over the next few weeks, Brian threw himself into planning the perfect proposal. He chose a beautiful restaurant overlooking the city, made sure Ms. Laverne's favorite flowers would be on the table, and even practiced his speech in front of the mirror. The evening of the proposal arrived, and Brian felt a mix of excitement and nervousness as he picked up Ms. Laverne. She looked radiant in a deep purple dress, her silver hair elegantly styled. "My, don't you look handsome tonight," Ms. Laverne said, her eyes twinkling as she took in Brian's suit. Brian smiled, trying to calm the butterflies in his stomach. "And you look absolutely stunning, Ms. Laverne." At the restaurant, they enjoyed a delicious meal, chatting and laughing. As dessert arrived, Brian knew it was time. He reached across the table and took Ms. Laverne's hand. "Ms. Laverne," he began, his voice shaking slightly. "These past few months have been incredible. You've shown me a world I never knew existed, filled with kindness and compassion." Ms. Laverne watched him intently, her expression unreadable. Brian continued, "I know there's an age difference between us, but I believe love knows no bounds. You've become such an important part of my life, and I can't imagine my future without you in it." He slid out of his chair and got down on one knee, pulling out a small velvet box. Ms. Laverne's eyes widened as he opened it, revealing a sparkling diamond ring. "Miss Laverne, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Ms. Laverne's eyes widened, her hand trembling slightly in Brian's grasp. For a moment, the bustling restaurant seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them in a bubble of anticipation. "Oh, Brian," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "This is unexpected." Brian's heart raced as he waited for her answer, the ring glinting in the soft candlelight. Ms. Laverne took a deep breath, her eyes never leaving Brian's. "You've brought so much joy into my life these past few months. I never thought I'd find companionship like this again." She paused, and Brian held his breath. "Yes," she said finally, a tear sliding down her cheek. "Yes, I will marry you, Brian." Relief and a strange mix of emotions washed over Brian as he slipped the ring onto her finger. He stood and embraced her, the restaurant erupting in applause around them. In the weeks that followed, they planned a small, intimate wedding. Ms. Laverne wanted something simple and elegant, and Brian was more than happy to agree. On a sunny Saturday afternoon, they gathered in Ms. Laverne's beautiful garden. A handful of her closest friends were in attendance, their faces a mix of joy and concern. Ms. Laverne looked radiant in a cream-colored dress, her silver hair adorned with small white flowers. Brian, dashing in a dark suit, couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked down the makeshift aisle. As they exchanged vows, Brian felt a lump form in his throat. Ms. Laverne's words were filled with such genuine love and hope for their future together. He pushed away the gnawing guilt in his chest and focused on the moment. After the ceremony, as they mingled with the guests, Brian couldn't help but notice the wary glances from some of Ms. Laverne's friends. He overheard snippets of hushed conversations, words like "too young" and "after her money" reaching his ears. But Ms. Laverne seemed oblivious to their doubts, her face glowing with happiness as she held onto Brian's arm. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with love and trust. "I'm so happy, Brian," she said softly. "I never thought I'd find love again at my age." Brian smiled down at her, pushing away his conflicting emotions. "I'm happy too, Ms. Laverne," he replied. And for a moment, he almost believed it himself. As the newlyweds settled into their life together, Brian found himself surrounded by luxury he had only dreamed of. Ms. Laverne's mansion was a grand affair, with sprawling gardens and rooms filled with antiques and artwork. He marveled at the sheer opulence of it all, his eyes constantly drawn to the signs of wealth around him. In the days following their wedding, Brian began to subtly probe into Ms. Laverne's financial affairs. He would casually bring up topics related to money during their conversations, hoping to glean information about her assets and investments. "My dear," he said one evening as they sat in the study, "I was thinking about our future together. Have you ever considered how we might manage our finances as a couple?" Ms. Laverne smiled warmly at him. "Oh, Brian, you're so thoughtful. I've always been quite open about my financial situation. I believe in transparency, especially with those closest to me." To Brian's surprise, Ms. Laverne began to share details about her various investments, charitable trusts, and business holdings. She spoke with clarity and confidence, demonstrating a keen understanding of her wealth. "You see," she explained, "I've worked hard to ensure my wealth is used responsibly. I have a team of financial advisors who help me manage everything." Brian nodded, trying to hide his growing frustration. Despite her openness, Ms. Laverne made it clear that she maintained firm control over her assets. "Of course, as my husband, I want you to be aware of our financial situation," she continued. "But I hope you understand that I've spent a lifetime building this wealth and using it to help others. I need to ensure it continues to be managed carefully." Brian forced a smile, masking his disappointment. "I understand completely, darling. I'm just happy to be here with you." As the days passed, Brian realized that gaining control over Ms. Laverne's wealth would be more challenging than he had anticipated. She was not only open about her finances, but also fiercely independent in managing them. His subtle attempts to influence her decisions were met with gentle but firm resistance. As the days turned into weeks, Brian's frustration grew. His plan to gain control of Ms. Laverne's wealth was moving at a snail's pace, and he felt trapped in a gilded cage. The mansion's opulence, once awe-inspiring, now felt suffocating. One afternoon, while Ms. Laverne was out at a charity event, Brian decided to take matters into his own hands. He began searching the mansion, room by room, looking for anything that might give him an edge. He rifled through drawers, peeked behind paintings, and even checked under loose floorboards. In the study, Brian's eyes fell on an ornate wooden box tucked away on a high shelf. His heart raced as he carefully lifted it down. Inside, he found a collection of old photographs and documents. As he sifted through them, one photo caught his attention. It was a faded color photograph showing a younger Ms. Laverne standing with a group of men. They all looked wealthy and distinguished, dressed in expensive suits, and standing in front of what appeared to be a grand hotel. Ms. Laverne was smiling broadly, her arm linked with one of the men. Brian's brow furrowed as he studied the image. Who were these men? And why did Ms. Laverne keep this photo hidden away? He turned the photograph over, hoping for some clue, but found only a date scrawled in faded ink, July 15th, 1985. As he stared at the photo, Brian's mind raced with possibilities. Could this be the key he'd been searching for? A secret from Miss Laverne's past that he could use to his advantage? The following day, while Brian was out running errands, a sleek black car pulled up to the mansion. A tall, well-dressed man stepped out, his face hidden beneath the brim of a fedora. He approached the front door with purposeful strides and rang the bell. Ms. Laverne's housekeeper answered, eyeing the stranger warily. "May I help you, sir?" The man's voice was deep and gravelly. "I have a message for Ms. Laverne. It's urgent." Before the housekeeper could respond, the man pressed a sealed envelope into her hands and turned on his heel, disappearing as quickly as he had arrived. When Brian returned home later that afternoon, he found the house oddly quiet. Ms. Laverne was napping, and the housekeeper had stepped out. As he passed through the foyer, a cream-colored envelope on the side table caught his eye. It was addressed to Ms. Laverne in an elegant, unfamiliar script. Brian's heart raced. Who could be writing to his wife? Glancing around to ensure he was alone, he carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the note inside. His eyes widened as he read, "My dear Laverne, I hope this message finds you well. I write to you out of concern for your safety and well-being. Your recent marriage has raised alarms among those who care about you. Please be cautious. Your new husband may not be who he claims to be. Trust your instincts and guard your heart. An old friend." Brian's hands shook as he refolded the note. His mind whirled with questions and fears. Who was this old friend? How much did they know? And most importantly, what would Ms. Laverne do if she read this warning? For a moment, Brian considered destroying the note. But as he heard Ms. Laverne stirring upstairs, he knew he couldn't risk it. Quickly, he resealed the envelope as best he could and placed it back on the table. As Ms. Laverne's footsteps approached, Brian's heart pounded. He plastered on a smile, determined to act as if nothing had happened. But inside, he was shaken to his core. His carefully constructed plan was suddenly on shaky ground, and he had no idea what to do next. As the days passed, Brian couldn't help but notice subtle changes in Ms. Laverne's demeanor. Her usual vibrant energy seemed to wane, and she often retired to bed earlier than usual. One morning, as they sat together for breakfast, Ms. Laverne's hand trembled slightly as she lifted her teacup to her lips. Are you feeling all right, dear? Brian asked, his brow furrowed with what appeared to be concern. Ms. Laverne offered a weak smile. Oh, it's nothing to worry about. Just a touch of fatigue, I suppose. But Brian wasn't convinced. He watched her closely over the next few days, noticing how she seemed to tire more easily and occasionally winced when she thought he wasn't looking. His mind raced with possibilities, each more alarming than the last. One afternoon, while Ms. Laverne napped, Brian paced in his study, his thoughts in turmoil. What if she was seriously ill? What if she had been hiding a grave condition from him all this time? The possibility of losing her before he had secured her wealth gnawed at him, filling him with a sense of urgency he hadn't felt before. He ran his hands through his hair, his breath coming in short gasps. This can't be happening, he muttered to himself. Not now, not when I'm so close. Brian's mind whirled with calculations. How much time did he have? How could he speed up his plans? The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, genuinely worried about Ms. Laverne's health, but not for the reasons a loving husband should be. As he sank into his chair, Brian felt a pang of guilt. Ms. Laverne had been nothing but kind to him, and here he was, more concerned about her money than her well-being. But he quickly pushed the feeling aside, reminding himself why he had entered this marriage in the first place. As Brian's concern for Ms. Laverne's health grew, he began to notice other strange occurrences around the mansion. One afternoon, while searching for his wife, he found a door that had always been open, now firmly locked. Puzzled, he tried the handle again, but it wouldn't budge. "Looking for something, Mr. Brian?" A voice startled him from behind. He turned to see Margaret, one of the older maids, eyeing him suspiciously. "Oh, I was just looking for Ms. Laverne," Brian replied smoothly. "Do you know where she might be?" Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. "She's resting in the sunroom, sir. Best not to disturb her." As Brian walked away, he could have sworn he heard Margaret whispering to another staff member. Their hushed tones made him uneasy, but he couldn't make out what they were saying. Over the next few days, Brian noticed more whispers among the staff. They would often fall silent when he entered a room, their eyes following him with a mix of curiosity and wariness. One evening, as Brian was helping Ms. Laverne sort through some old photo albums, he came across a picture that made him pause. It showed a much younger Ms. Laverne standing next to a handsome man he didn't recognize. "Who's this?" Brian asked, trying to keep his tone casual. Ms. Laverne glanced at the photo, a wistful smile crossing her face. "That's Charles, my second husband. Such a kind man he was." Brian's eyebrows shot up. "Second husband? I didn't know you were married before." Ms. Laverne chuckled softly. "Oh yes, dear. I've been married 3 times before you. Each one left me a widow, I'm afraid." Brian felt a chill run down his spine. 3 times? He repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Ms. Laverne nodded, seemingly lost in memories. "Yes, each one passed away rather suddenly. It was quite tragic. But they all left me quite comfortable, bless their hearts." Brian's mind reeled with this new information. 3 previous husbands, all dead under mysterious circumstances, and each leaving Ms. Laverne wealthier than before. He looked at his wife with new eyes, wondering just how much he really knew about the woman he had married. Brian's mind raced as he tried to process the information about Ms. Laverne's previous marriages. He found himself watching her more closely, analyzing her every move and word. The once charming elderly woman now seemed like a mystery he couldn't solve. One morning at breakfast, Ms. Laverne offered Brian a cup of coffee. As she poured, her hand trembled slightly, spilling a few drops on the tablecloth. "Oh, clumsy me," she chuckled, reaching for a napkin. Brian's eyes darted from the spilled coffee to Ms. Laverne's face. Was it just an accident, or had she meant to pour it on him? He pushed the cup away, mumbling about not being thirsty. Ms. Laverne frowned. "Are you feeling all right, dear? You've been awfully quiet lately." "I'm fine," Brian replied quickly, his voice higher than usual. "Just not sleeping well." As days passed, Brian's paranoia grew. He started checking his food before eating, convinced that Ms. Laverne might be trying to poison him. He avoided being alone with her, always making sure there was a staff member nearby. One evening, Ms. Laverne suggested they take a walk in the garden. Brian hesitated, his palms sweating. "What's the matter?" Ms. Laverne asked, her brow furrowed with concern. "Nothing," Brian lied, forcing a smile. It's getting dark. Maybe we should stay inside." Ms. Laverne studied him for a moment. "Brian, you've been acting strange lately. Is something bothering you?" Brian's heart raced. Did she suspect that he knew about her past? Was she planning to get rid of him like her previous husbands? "I'm fine," he insisted, backing away slightly. "Just tired, that's all." Ms. Laverne reached out to touch his arm, and Brian flinched involuntarily. Her eyes widened in surprise, and a flicker of hurt crossed her face. "Brian," she said softly, "what's happened to you?" Ms. Laverne's gentle eyes searched Brian's face, worry etched in her wrinkled brow. She reached out and took his hand, her touch warm and comforting despite Brian's growing unease. "My dear," she said softly, "something's troubling you. I can see it in your eyes. Please, tell me what's wrong." Brian's heart raced. He felt trapped, like a caged animal with nowhere to run. His mind scrambled for an excuse, anything to throw her off the scent. "It's nothing, really," he stammered, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I've just been stressed about work stuff. You know how it is." Ms. Laverne didn't look convinced. She patted his hand gently. "Brian, we're married now. Your problems are my problems. Let me help you." Her kindness only made Brian feel worse. Guilt gnawed at him, mixing with his fear and paranoia. He pulled his hand away, trying to ignore the hurt look on Ms. Laverne's face. "I appreciate your concern," he said, his voice strained. "But I can handle it. I just need some time to myself." As he walked away, leaving Ms. Laverne looking lost and confused in the living room, Brian's mind raced. He needed a plan. He couldn't stay here, not with the growing certainty that Ms. Laverne was planning something sinister. In the privacy of his study, Brian began to formulate an escape plan. He'd need money, lots of it. His eyes darted to the safe hidden behind a painting. Ms. Laverne had shown him the combination once, trusting him completely. The irony wasn't lost on him. Brian's hands shook as he started making a mental list of what he'd need. Passport, cash, a new identity maybe. His stomach churned with a mix of fear and guilt, but he pushed it down. This was about survival now, he told himself. As he plotted, Brian couldn't shake the image of Ms. Laverne's hurt expression. For a moment, doubt crept in. Was he making a terrible mistake? Brian's hands trembled as he rifled through Ms. Laverne's desk drawer. He knew he shouldn't be snooping, but his paranoia had reached a fever pitch. His heart nearly stopped when he found a small notebook hidden beneath some papers. Opening it with shaking fingers, Brian's eyes widened in horror. Page after page was filled with notes about various poisons, their effects, dosages, and how to obtain them. His breath caught in his throat as he read the careful, neat handwriting that was unmistakably Ms. Laverne's. "Oh God," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the quiet room. "She's really planning to do it." As if to confirm his worst fears, a small business card fell out of the notebook. It belonged to a pharmacist named Dr. Reeves, with a handwritten note on the back. "Next batch ready on Friday." Brian's mind raced, connecting the dots. The mysterious illnesses of Ms. Laverne's previous husbands, her vast wealth, and now this evidence of poison research. It all pointed to a chilling conclusion. He stumbled back, nearly knocking over a chair in his haste. The room seemed to spin around him as panic set in. Brian's paranoia, which had been building for weeks, now felt completely justified. Just then he heard Ms. Laverne's voice calling from downstairs. "Brian, dear? Are you up there?" Her gentle tone, which once brought him comfort, now sent chills down his spine. Brian quickly shoved the notebook and card back into the drawer, trying to leave everything as he found it. "Coming," he called back, his voice cracking slightly. He took a deep breath, trying to compose himself. As he descended the stairs, Brian's mind was in overdrive. He was now convinced that Ms. Laverne was planning to kill him. just as she had allegedly done with her previous husbands. Every smile, every touch, every kind word from Ms. Laverne now seemed sinister to Brian. He watched her carefully as she poured him a cup of tea, his eyes darting between her hands and the steaming liquid. Was this how it would happen? A tasteless, odorless poison slipped into his drink? Brian's heart raced as he watched Ms. Laverne sip her tea, her gentle smile suddenly seeming sinister. He couldn't take it anymore. The fear and paranoia that had been building for weeks finally burst out of him like a dam breaking. "I know what you're planning," Brian blurted out, his voice shaking with emotion. "You're trying to kill me, just like you did with your other husbands." Ms. Laverne's cup clattered against its saucer as she set it down, her eyes wide with shock. "Brian, what on earth are you talking about?" "Don't play innocent with me," Brian said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I found your notebook about poisons. I saw the pharmacist's card. It all makes sense now, how you got so wealthy, why your other husbands died." Ms. Laverne stood slowly, her face a mixture of confusion and concern. "Sweetheart, you're not making any sense. Please calm down and let's talk about this." But Brian was beyond reason. He backed away from her, his eyes wild with fear. "You're after my life insurance, aren't you? That's why you married me so quickly. You never loved me at all." "Brian, please," Ms. Laverne pleaded, her voice trembling. "You're frightening me. I don't know what you think you've found, but there's been a terrible misunderstanding." She took a step towards him, her hand outstretched in a gesture of comfort, but Brian flinched away as if her touch might burn him. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice cracking. "I won't let you poison me like the others. I won't." Ms. Laverne's face crumpled with hurt and confusion. "Poison you? Brian, I would never. I love you. Please, let me explain." But Brian was too far gone in his paranoia to listen. He paced the room like a caged animal, his eyes darting from Ms. Laverne to the exits, looking for any sign of danger. As Brian reached for the doorknob, his hand trembling, Ms. Laverne's soft voice stopped him in his tracks. "Brian, wait," she said, her tone calm and steady. "There's something you need to know." He turned slowly, eyeing her with suspicion. Ms. Laverne stood tall, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. "I've known about your plan from the beginning," she said quietly. Brian's face paled. "What?" Ms. Laverne sighed deeply. "I knew you married me for my money, Brian. I'm not as naive as you thought." Brian's mouth opened and closed, words failing him. His mind raced, trying to make sense of this revelation. But why?" he finally managed to stammer. Ms. Laverne's eyes softened. "Because I'm dying, Brian. I have terminal cancer." The words hit Brian like a punch to the gut. He staggered back, leaning against the wall for support. "I don't have much time left," Ms. Laverne continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I wanted to use what little I have to help someone, to make a difference." Brian shook his head, confusion etched across his face. "I don't understand." Ms. Laverne took a step closer, her eyes never leaving his. "I saw something in you, Brian. Beneath all the scheming and desperation, I saw a good man struggling to break free. I married you because I believe I can help you become that man." Tears welled up in Brian's eyes as the weight of her words sank in. All his fears and paranoia melted away, replaced by a crushing sense of shame and regret. "But why me?" he asked, his voice cracking. Ms. Laverne smiled gently. "Because everyone deserves a second chance, Brian. Even you." Brian stumbled back, his legs suddenly weak. He sank into a nearby chair, his mind reeling from Ms. Laverne's words. The room seemed to spin around him as he struggled to process what he had just heard. "Terminal cancer?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Ms. Laverne nodded slowly, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and determination. "Yes, Brian. I don't have much time left." She moved closer, her steps measured and deliberate. Sitting down across from him, she reached out and took his trembling hands in hers. "I've been watching you, Brian," she said softly. "I've seen how you've changed since we met. You may have come here with selfish intentions, but I believe there's so much more to you than that." Brian's eyes filled with tears. The shame he felt was overwhelming, threatening to crush him under its weight. But I lied to you. I manipulated you. How can you say that? Ms. Laverne smiled gently. Because I've seen glimpses of the real you. The man who lights up when he talks about helping others at the charity. The one who goes out of his way to make the staff feel appreciated. That's the Brian I want to nurture. She squeezed his hands tightly. I've been preparing you, Brian. All those meetings, the charity events, the conversations about my work. It wasn't just idle chatter. I've been grooming you to take over my charitable foundation. Brian's eyes widened in disbelief. Me? But I don't know anything about running a charity. I'm not a good person, Ms. Laverne. You are, she insisted, her voice firm. You just haven't had the chance to see it yet. But I have, and I believe in you. I want you to carry on my work, to help others the way you were meant to. Brian shook his head, overwhelmed by the enormity of what Ms. Laverne was saying. I don't deserve this. After everything I've done? Ms. Laverne cupped his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. We all deserve second chances, Brian. This is yours. Will you take it? Ms. Laverne took a deep breath, her eyes misting with memories. She gently patted Brian's hand, drawing his attention back to her. There's more you need to know, Brian, she said softly. Those husbands of mine, well, their stories aren't quite what you might think. Brian leaned in, his curiosity piqued despite his emotional turmoil. Ms. Laverne's voice took on a wistful tone as she began to share. Each of those men, they were good souls trapped in bad situations. Dangerous lives they couldn't escape on their own. She paused, her gaze distant. I helped them, Brian. I gave them a chance at a new life. Brian's brow furrowed in confusion. But they died, didn't they? Ms. Laverne shook her head, a small smile playing on her lips. No, dear. We faked their deaths. It was the only way to ensure their safety, to give them a fresh start. Brian's eyes widened in astonishment. You mean they're still out there, living new lives? Yes, Ms. Laverne nodded. Each of them got a second chance at life, free from the dangers that haunted them. She turned her gaze back to Brian, her eyes filled with warmth and hope. And that's what I wanted for you, Brian. A chance to start over, to become the man I know you can be. Brian felt a lump form in his throat. You were going to do that for me? Ms. Laverne squeezed his hand. I am doing that for you, Brian. Right now. This is your chance to leave behind the life that's been weighing you down, to become someone who helps others, who makes a real difference in the world. Tears welled up in Brian's eyes as the full impact of Ms. Laverne's words hit him. She had seen through his schemes from the beginning, yet still chose to believe in him, to offer him redemption. Brian sat in stunned silence, his mind reeling from Ms. Laverne's revelations. The weight of his actions crashed down upon him, and he felt a wave of shame wash over his entire being. He looked at Ms. Laverne, her kind eyes filled with understanding, and felt a sharp pang in his chest. I don't know what to say, Brian stammered, his voice thick with emotion. All this time I thought I was so wrong about everything. Ms. Laverne reached out and patted his hand gently. We all make mistakes, Brian. It's what we do after that truly matters. Her words struck a chord deep within him. Brian's mind raced back through his life, recalling all the times he had chosen the easy path, the selfish route. He had buried his conscience so deep, he'd almost forgotten it existed. But now, faced with Ms. Laverne's unwavering belief in him, he felt that long, dormant part of himself stirring to life. You saw something in me, Brian said softly, his eyes brimming with tears. Something I couldn't even see in myself anymore. Ms. Laverne nodded, a warm smile on her face. Because it's there, Brian. It always has been. In that moment, Brian made a decision. He took a deep breath and looked Ms. Laverne in the eye. I want to stay, he said firmly. Not for the money, not for any scheme. I want to help you, to learn from you. I want to be the person you believe I can be. Ms. Laverne's eyes sparkled with joy and a hint of tears. "Oh, Brian," she whispered. "That's all I ever wanted for you." Brian felt a weight lift from his shoulders, replaced by a sense of purpose he had never known before. He realized that in trying to con Ms. Laverne, he had stumbled upon the greatest gift of all, a chance at redemption, an opportunity to become a better man. As the days passed, Brian found himself immersed in a world he had never known before. Ms. Laverne's charitable work opened his eyes to the struggles and triumphs of people from all walks of life. Each morning they would sit together at the breakfast table, poring over letters and requests for help. "This one's from a single mother of 3, Ms. Laverne said, handing Brian a letter. "She's trying to go back to school but can't afford childcare." Brian read the letter, feeling a lump form in his throat. "What can we do for her?" Ms. Laverne smiled warmly. "That's what we're here to figure out, dear." Together they worked on solutions, making calls, and arranging support for those in need. Brian found himself deeply moved by the stories they encountered and the difference they were making. One afternoon, they visited a shelter Ms. Laverne had helped establish years ago. As they walked through the building, Brian watched in awe as people approached Ms. Laverne, their faces lighting up with gratitude and affection. "Ms. Laverne!" a young woman called out, rushing over to hug her. "I got the job! The one you helped me prepare for!" Ms. Laverne beamed, embracing the woman tightly. "Oh, Sarah, that's wonderful news. I'm so proud of you." Brian stood back watching the scene unfold. He felt a warmth spreading through his chest, a feeling he couldn't quite name. As they left the shelter, he turned to Ms. Laverne. "The way they look at you," he said softly. "It's like you've given them hope." Ms. Laverne squeezed his arm gently. "Hope is the most powerful gift we can give, Brian. It can change lives." In that moment, Brian realized how much Ms. Laverne had changed his own life. He no longer saw her as a target or a means to an end. She had become his mentor, his friend, and the guiding light he never knew he needed. As they continued their work together, Brian found himself looking forward to their conversations, eager to learn from Ms. Laverne's wisdom and experience. He began to see the world through her eyes, recognizing the potential for good in every person they encountered. As the weeks passed, Ms. Laverne's health began to visibly decline. Her steps grew slower and she tired more easily. Yet her spirit remained undiminished, her eyes still twinkling with warmth and determination. One morning, Brian found her at her desk, surrounded by papers and looking pale. "Ms. Laverne, you should be resting," he said gently. She looked up at him with a smile. "There's still so much to do, Brian. We can't stop now." Brian's heart ached at her words. He pulled up a chair beside her. "Let me help. Tell me what needs to be done." Ms. Laverne patted his hand. "You're a good boy, Brian. I think it's time you took on more responsibility." Over the next few days, Brian found himself diving headfirst into the world of charity work. He organized fundraising events, coordinated with local businesses for donations, and oversaw the distribution of resources to those in need. At first, it felt overwhelming. There were so many details to manage, so many people counting on him. But as he threw himself into the work, something changed within him. For the first time in his life, Brian felt a sense of purpose. He worked tirelessly, often staying up late into the night to make sure everything was perfect. Ms. Laverne watched him with pride, offering guidance when needed, but mostly letting him find his own way. One evening, after a successful charity gala, Brian sat with Ms. Laverne in her study. She looked tired, but happy. "You did wonderfully tonight, Brian," she said softly. "I saw how you connected with people, how you inspired them to give." Brian felt a warmth spread through his chest. "I never knew I could do something like this," he admitted. "It feels right." Ms. Laverne reached out and squeezed his hand. "That's because you found your purpose, dear. You're making a difference in people's lives." As Brian looked into her eyes, he realized how much he had changed. The man who had schemed to marry her for money seemed like a distant memory. In its place was someone new, someone who cared deeply about others and wanted to make the world a better place. As the days passed, Ms. Laverne's condition deteriorated rapidly. Her once vibrant eyes now held a tired, glassy look, and her voice grew weaker with each passing day. Despite her failing health, her mind remained sharp, focused on the task at hand. One afternoon, as Brian helped her settle into her favorite armchair by the window, Ms. Laverne took his hand in hers. "Brian, my dear," she said softly, "it's time we talk about what comes next." Brian felt a lump form in his throat. He knew this moment was coming, but it didn't make it any easier. "Of course, Ms. Laverne, whatever you need." She smiled weakly. "I need you to promise me something. Promise me that you'll continue my work, that you'll make sure my legacy lives on." Brian nodded, his eyes filling with tears. "I promise. I'll do everything I can." Over the next few days, Ms. Laverne spent hours with Brian, going over every detail of her estate and charitable foundations. She showed him where important documents were kept, explained the intricacies of each charity's mission, and introduced him to key contacts who would help him navigate this new world. "Remember," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "the money is just a tool. It's what you do with it that matters." Brian listened intently, taking notes and asking questions. He was determined to get everything right, to honor the trust Ms. Laverne had placed in him. As they worked, Brian couldn't help but marvel at the scope of Ms. Laverne's philanthropy. She had touched so many lives, helped so many people. The thought of carrying on her work was daunting, but he was committed to trying. "You have a good heart, Brian," Ms. Laverne told him one evening. "I knew it from the moment I met you, even if you didn't see it yourself back then." Brian felt a pang of guilt at her words, remembering his initial motives for pursuing her. But Ms. Laverne squeezed his hand reassuringly. "What matters is who you are now," she said, as if reading his thoughts, "and who you'll become." As the days turned into weeks, Ms. Laverne's strength continued to fade. Brian remained by her side, tending to her needs and managing her affairs. One crisp autumn morning, as the sun peeked through the curtains, Ms. Laverne opened her eyes and whispered, "It's time." Brian, understanding her meaning, called the doctor and reached out to those closest to Ms. Laverne. Within hours, the room was filled with people whose lives she had touched, former employees, charity workers, and friends she had helped over the years. As they gathered around her bed, Ms. Laverne's eyes sparkled with a renewed energy. She looked at each face, smiling softly before her gaze settled on Brian. "Thank you," she mouthed, her voice too weak to be heard. Brian held her hand, tears streaming down his face. He watched as Ms. Laverne took her final breath, slipping away peacefully, surrounded by love and gratitude. The room fell silent, filled with a mix of sorrow and reverence. Brian felt a deep ache in his chest, a pain he had never experienced before. It wasn't just grief, it was the weight of loss combined with an overwhelming sense of responsibility. As he looked around at the tear-stained faces, Brian realized that Ms. Laverne had given him more than just financial security. She had given him a family, a purpose, and a chance to be the man he never thought he could be. In that moment, surrounded by the people Ms. Laverne had helped and loved, Brian felt a renewed sense of purpose wash over him. He understood that her legacy wasn't just about the money or the charities. It was about the lives she had changed, including his own. Ms. Laverne had seen something in him that he hadn't seen in himself. She had believed in him, given him a second chance at life, and entrusted him with her life's work. As he stood there, holding her hand one last time, Brian silently vowed to honor her faith in him and continue her mission of helping others. In the weeks following Ms. Laverne's passing, Brian threw himself into managing her estate and charities. He pored over the detailed instructions she had left, determined to honor her wishes and continue her legacy. At first, the task seemed overwhelming. There were countless documents to review, meetings to attend, and decisions to make. But Brian found strength in remembering Ms. Laverne's unwavering faith in him. He approached each challenge with the same determination and compassion she had shown throughout her life. Brian started by organizing a memorial service that celebrated Ms. Laverne's life and her impact on the community. The event brought together hundreds of people whose lives she had touched. As Brian stood at the podium sharing stories of Ms. Laverne's kindness and generosity, he felt a sense of purpose growing within him. In the months that followed, Brian immersed himself in Ms. Laverne's charitable work. He visited shelters, schools, and community centers, listening to the needs of those Ms. Laverne had helped. He used her wealth to fund scholarships, build affordable housing, and support local businesses. As time passed, Brian's reputation began to grow. People who had once been skeptical of his intentions now saw him as a dedicated philanthropist. He became known for his hands-on approach, often working alongside volunteers and getting to know the people he was helping. One day, while serving meals at a soup kitchen Ms. Laverne had supported, an elderly man approached Brian. With tears in his eyes, he said, "You remind me of her, you know, Ms. Laverne. She always said that true wealth was measured by the lives you touched, not the money in your bank account." Those words struck a chord in Brian's heart. He realized that he had found something far more valuable than the financial security he had once sought. He had found purpose, fulfillment, and a way to make a real difference in the world. As Brian sat in Ms. Laverne's study, now his own, he gazed at her portrait on the wall. His eyes filled with tears as he remembered the woman who had changed his life in ways he never could have imagined. He thought back to the day he first heard about Ms. Laverne in that dingy bar, desperate and drowning in debt. Brian shook his head, hardly able to recognize the man he used to be. That Brian had been selfish, manipulative, and willing to do anything for money. Now, as he looked around at the photos of smiling faces, people whose lives he had helped change, he felt a warmth in his heart that no amount of wealth could ever provide. Ms. Laverne's words echoed in his mind, "True wealth is measured by the lives you touch." Brian finally understood what she meant. Every scholarship awarded, every family housed, every meal served was a testament to her wisdom and his own transformation. He picked up a framed photo of himself and Ms. Laverne at a charity event. Her kind eyes seemed to look right through him, even now. Brian remembered how she had known his true intentions all along, but chose to see the good in him anyway. She had given him a chance when he least deserved it, and in doing so, she had saved him from a life of emptiness and greed. Tears rolled down Brian's cheeks as gratitude overwhelmed him. Ms. Laverne had seen something in him that he hadn't even seen in himself. She had believed in his potential for goodness and had patiently guided him towards it. Through her example and her unwavering faith in him, she had shown Brian a different way to live, a life of purpose, compassion, and genuine happiness. As he set the photo down, Brian made a silent promise to Ms. Laverne. He would continue to honor her legacy, not just through managing her charities, but by living the values she had instilled in him. He would approach each day with the same kindness and wisdom she had shown, always looking for the potential for good in others, just as she had done for him. Brian stood in front of the gleaming new building, his heart swelling with pride and emotion. The sign above the entrance read Ms. Laverne Community Center, and he could almost feel her presence beside him, beaming with joy. The sound of children's laughter filled the air as they played on the brightly colored playground equipment. Families gathered on benches and picnic tables, sharing meals and conversations. The center was alive with activity, just as Ms. Laverne had always envisioned. As Brian watched, he saw a young boy help a smaller child up after a fall. The simple act of kindness brought tears to his eyes. This was exactly what Ms. Laverne had wanted, a place where people could come together, support one another, and build a stronger community. He thought back to the man he used to be, so focused on his own needs and desires. Now, looking at the thriving community center, Brian felt a deep sense of fulfillment that no amount of money could ever provide. He had found his purpose in continuing Ms. Laverne's work, and it brought him a peace he had never known before. A woman approached Brian, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you for all you've done," she said softly. "This place has changed our lives." Brian smiled, knowing that it was Ms. Laverne who deserved the thanks. He had merely followed the path she had shown him. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the center, Brian felt a profound sense of contentment. He knew, without a doubt, that he had become the man Ms. Laverne had always believed he could be. Her legacy lived on, not just in the bricks and mortar of the community center, but in every life touched by its presence. Do you think Brian truly deserves the second chance Ms. Laverne offers him? Yes or no? Let me know in the comments below. I would love to hear your perspective. And if you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to my channel. I am spending hours upon hours writing these heartwarming stories for you, and your support is what keeps me going.